Hello, everyone. Oh, yeah, we're just getting started right now. I can see a question coming through the chat. Yeah, we're starting now. Welcome to the second webinar of the Salish Sea BioBlitz. I'm so excited to welcome you all here. My name is Kirsten Matheson. For those of you who don't know, I'm the Public Engagement Coordinator at Georgia Strait Alliance, which is a marine conservation organization that has been working to advocate for the health and sustainability of communities around the Salish Sea for 30 years. Before we get started, I'd also like to introduce my co-host, Chelsea, who is my dear friend and a member of the Ocean Bridge cohort who is helping plan and execute this BioBlitz.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chelsea. So I'm in the Ocean Bridge 2020 cohort. Kirsten is an alumni of Ocean Bridge. In case you don't know what Ocean Bridge is, it's a national youth program from OceanWise that brings together Canadians between the ages of 18 and 30 to organize and participate in ocean and waterway service projects. Chuck is also an alumni of Ocean Bridge. So I've been helping organize the Salish Sea BioBlitz as one of my Ocean Bridge community service projects. So what is a BioBlitz? It's like a biological inventory, but instead of scientists collecting data, anyone can. It's a form of citizen science aimed to collect data about as many life forms in a certain area and specific time frame as possible. So the Salish Sea BioBlitz is taking place right now all across the Salish Sea bioregion, and we're utilizing the app iNaturalist so that everyone in the Salish Sea bioregion can participate while maintaining the COVID-19 physical distancing measures. To join the Great Salish Sea BioBlitz, all you have to do is download the iNaturalist app and join the Great Salish Sea BioBlitz project. Right now, a little update. We have over, hold on a second, a little update. We have 1,270 observations and 484 different species recorded.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. We're very excited about the participation in the BioBlitz so far. Oops. And we're also very excited to welcome Chuck here today to discuss some of the intersections between identity and access to the ocean and blue spaces, and should the next Little Mermaid should be black. And as Chelsea said, Chuck is another alumni of Ocean Bridge, so we're like 3 generations of Ocean Bridge, which is fun. But, and then this is Chuck's little biography. So before he gets started, Chuck is proudly Franco-Albertan, and his passion lies in the interactions between culture, health, and the environment. He recently started his PhD at the University of Ottawa in medical geography after completing a master's degree from the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal. Chuck is your typical urbanite in love with technology and fashion, all the while retaining a connection with nature and integrating blue and green spaces into his everyday. His vision to reconnect humanity with nature in a way that accommodates modernity, sparking the green revolution without decimation of the present. So we're very excited to explore some of those ideas today and to get to know Chuck a little bit more and learn with you. So for people who are listening in, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and say where you're joining from. We'd really love to connect and just like learn about everyone who's here joining us. And if you have any questions for Chuck, throw them in the Q&A and we can get started.
Okay, that is my cue. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Oh, I need to come up with a new bio because I feel like that bio makes me feel so pompous. Kirsten, it says sharing screen disabled. If you could allow me to share my screen, please.
Some tech problems here. I mean, it's a quick fix, but 1 second. Okay, you should be able to now.
Perfect. Excellent. Can everyone see my screen? I can't see the chat box, so Kirsten, if you could just give me a verbal yes or no.
Yes.
Perfect, perfect. Okay. So, bonjour tout le monde. My name is Chúk Odenigbo, and I'm so honored and pleased to be sort of in front of y'all today. welcome to the Salish Sea Bio Blitz. This is very exciting for me. So, as Kirsten and Chelsea have explained, the Salish Sea Bio Blitz is, as Kirsten and Chelsea have explained, the Salish Sea Bio Blitz is a week-long event. They've been a couple of, they had a webinar yesterday that was really, really interesting, and they've got a couple more for the rest of the week. So I hope that you guys are able to join us for the rest of the week, as there's some very interesting talks by some very, very interesting people happening. So, juste un petit point linguistique. La présentation va dérouler en anglais uniquement. Cependant, tous les dépôts sont bilingues. Donc, si vous avez si vous voulez, vous pouvez me suivre à travers les mots écrits. Je suis aussi heureux de répondre à vos questions en français si vous mettez ça dans le chat box. Just a quick linguistic point, the presentation will be happening in English. However, all of my slides are bilingual, so if I do accidentally switch languages at any point, feel free to follow along via text, and I'll be happy to answer any questions in the chat box in either English or French. Let's get this party started. So today I'll be talking about the Next Little why the Next Little Mermaid should be Black, and in sort of discussing this, we'll be talking about how identity impacts our access to the oceans and what that effectively means for inclusivity when it comes to ocean health, ocean literacy, and raising awareness for the ocean or acting for the ocean. So a little bit about me. You guys already heard my bio from Kirsten, but essentially I'm Frank Alberton, originally from Calgary, and I'm currently doing a PhD in medical geography at the University of Ottawa. So medical geography is a field that looks at how place impacts human health. And so my research specifically is looking at how we can integrate place and culture into public health actions and public health resources, sort of integrating both nature and the environment into formal sort of healthcare systems and formal healthcare efforts. I'm also a previous ambassador for Mountain Equipment Co-op for the outdoors. So essentially my role when I was with MEC was to bring young people between the ages of 18 and 35 in urban areas into outdoor spaces, following suit with MEC's pledge of diversity to diversify outdoor spaces in Canada. So it involved me creating a lot of sort of innovative and different ways to bring different people into nature and have people connect in their own way on their own terms. I'm also a previous member of the Ocean Bridge cohort from 2018, the inaugural cohort. And Chelsea has explained what Ocean Bridge is, so I will not repeat myself. And I've also been lucky enough to be listed as one of the top 25 environmentalists under 25 in Canada for 3 years. So all of this to say that I'm coming at you from the perspective of a young person who has done a lot of work in environmental spaces and is constantly looking at ways in which we can bring more people into nature. I'm also the Director of Ancestral Services for Future Ancestor Services. So Future Ancestor Services is a Black and Indigenous owned and run youth-led professional services enterprise. And so our mandate essentially is to make Canada a better country for the generation that follows us, in acknowledging that we are that generation's ancestors. And so in sort of acknowledging that, we try and act through a lens of climate justice, through a lens of equity, really sort of centering both the environment and humanity. So both human and non-human beings in the work that we do. We are also a social enterprise, and so part of the work that we do is we do offer sort of speaking services. We offer training services, anti-racism training, training for the environment, climate change training, all that sort of thing. We offer community-based services, healing circles, for example. And really, we're just sort of trying to acknowledge our ancestry, so who we are as people in Canada, effectively. So who our ancestors are, and sort of what that means for us as individuals. Like, what does that mean in terms of our responsibility towards the next generation? What does that mean in terms of our responsibility to the present day reality? You know, how have our ancestors helped shape today, and what responsibility do we have in helping shape tomorrow? So that's a little bit about us and our sort of philosophy as a company. As I mentioned, we are also a social enterprise. So one of the things that we try and do is we try and support minorities in Canada through the work that they attempt to do. So when we say minorities, we're really sort of being fully inclusive of what a minority is. We're looking at BIPOC people, so Black, Indigenous people of color. We're looking at the LGBTQS community. We're looking at young people. We're looking at Francophones in the Canadian situation. Really sort of all that encompasses being a minority. And so we look to support minorities in their professional services, in their capacity to do work, in their capacity to create sustainable change in Canada for the next generation, to make things better for the next generation. And so part of that is our Wei grants, where we, invest in businesses run by Black, Indigenous, racialized, LGBTQS, Francophone, disabled, etc. People whose work centers on equity and climate justice. We launched in April 2020 and have since gathered a community of over 80 clients and mobilized over $20,000 of crowdsourced donations to do some of the social enterprise work that we try and do. So really exciting stuff, very young company. You should check us out on social media at Ancestors Future. And without further ado, let's start the presentation. So first of all, let's take a moment to sort of recognize the land on which we find ourselves, recognize the history of the land on which we're on. So normally before a land acknowledgement, I like to share these two quotes. So la première citation est par Negan Sinclair qui dit que faire une reconnaissance d'appartenance de la terre devrait être la chose la plus importante que les Canadiens font avant qu'un événement commence. C'est une analyse fondamentale de qui nous sommes, d'où nous nous trouvons et comment nous devrions procéder. Donc, selon ce mot, on voit comment c'est important de reconnaître notre histoire, de reconnaître notre passé individuel, mais également notre passé collectif en tant que pays, afin de savoir quelle est la meilleure manière d'avancer, quelle est la meilleure manière de faire la réconciliation. Et donc, de faire une reconnaissance territoire est une manière de faire ça. Et c'est important, c'est fondamental. En tant que Canadien, qu'on fasse à chaque événement, à chaque fois, avant que quelque chose commence. And I would also like to share this quote by Stella Caban. If you aren't immediately asking questions upon your arrival or of your ancestors' arrival on the land you are on, and about your role, history, and relationship to that land, then there needs to be some questions asked about how we perpetuate contemporary colonial erasure and violence. And I think this is a very powerful quote as well, because it kind of really demonstrates that in not doing an acknowledgement with our hearts, because we've all heard land acknowledgements that are very much like they're done because they're supposed to be done. But you want a real land acknowledgement to recognize who you are, what your ancestry is, where you are, what your present day situation is, and what it is you seek to do in the future. What are your responsibilities for the future? Who do you need to be supporting to make a better future? And without doing that, if we're not fully doing that, if we're not committed to doing that, we are perpetuating colonial erasure. We're erasing history, but then we're also erasing a potential future. So with that being said, I've tailored today's land acknowledgement for the Salish Sea region in British Columbia, just to sort of recognize where many of you are and where this event has been crafted and conceptualized. However, in recognizing that this event is online and many of you may be in other locations, I request that you make your land acknowledgement unique to you. I encourage you to use this moment to reflect on your identity and the land on which you own, and really sort of formulate something from your heart that is meaningful to you. And then if you're comfortable, please also share the land acknowledgement, not necessarily a land acknowledgement, but please share the land on which you find yourself in the chat box as well. And if you have trouble knowing which whose land on which you're on, there's some really great websites that I think Kirsten will be posting in the chat box for you to be able to use to find out the land on which you're on. As a Black French Canadian living in Canada, I'd like to pay respect to all of these. It is due to their stewardship and love of these waters that the Salish Sea has become one of the most biologically rich inland seas in the world. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest Coast have continued and continue to demand climate justice, sovereignty, and the right to live. It is imperative that we take our direction from these peoples and the knowledge systems, teachings, and cultures that inherently center the earth and her well-being. I'd also like to pay respect to all the other Indigenous people from all nations across Canada who call the Salish region home, whether they be young or old, as they too continue to seek climate justice and the right to live with dignity and self-respect in following their cultural teachings and systems. I'd also like to recognize the history of slavery and indentured servitude in Canada and pay respect to all the Black and non-Black peoples whose blood went into building this nation. Specific to BC, I'd like to pay respect to Chinese Canadians who worked as indentured servants to build the railway that connected Canada as a country, only to then have discriminatory laws enacted to prohibit their ability to prosper in the country that they connected and whose descendants to this day still have the right to belong in Canada questioned on a daily basis. It is in large part thanks to the resistance and constant fight that Canada abolished race-based policies surrounding immigration, which has benefited all of us across this land. And finally, to all the other immigrants that fell in love with the Salish Sea area and British Columbia and gave these waters and this land their offspring, their legacies, and their lives, thank you. Immigrants to Canada and to British Columbia have had to fight through layers of discrimination and racism, and yet have loved this land with all of their hearts and have contributed to their home and the home of their future generations with love and respect. I think in doing that land acknowledgement, it makes a really nice transition into what we're going to be talking about today, because we are talking about identity and we are talking about heritage. And so I thought this was a really good quote to start us off on. So this quote is by Heinz Pagels, and it says, c'est de l'identité qu'est née la différence. It is from identity that difference is born. So it is from that identity that difference is born, and it's how we treat that difference that determines our worth as society. How we treat people who are different from the mainstream, that is how we measure our worth as society. So, who are you? How do you identify? So when we think about identity, identity normally takes two forms. We have what I like to call our internal or chosen identity. And I use chosen very loosely because a lot of times we don't choose a lot of the aspects of our identity that we are given, right? So I'm thinking about cultural background. I'm thinking about religion. I'm thinking about sexual orientation. You know, you don't choose your sexual orientation. However, you can choose to take on that as part of your identity, or you can choose to reject that aspect internally as a part of your identity. You know, we look at education institution. A lot of people, for example, I went to Queen's University. Queen's is very well known for having the students feel very much a part of community. And so for the rest of their lives, they define themselves as Queen's alumni. They define themselves as Queen's grads. And there are many universities that create that sense of identity. You know, some people define themselves by their profession. You know, I think artists are a really good example of this, where they sort of live, breathe, die by like their art and their work and, you know, the way they see the world. You know, you can also see this in the medical profession as well. Some people define themselves by their political association, for example. And so these are sort of, you know, what we choose, what we say, you know, when someone asks us, you know, who are you? You know, this is what comes to mind. You know, you think of yourself as, you might think of yourself as a Christian. You might think of yourself as a Jew. You might think of yourself as a Jamaican Canadian. You may think of yourself as a Chinese Canadian. You know, these are things that we sort of, to a limited extent, choose, but then also these are internal to us. They're inherent to how we see the world. But then we also have the peripheral identity. So these are the identity that society gives to us, whether or not we accept them. And so these are identities based around skin color, around gender impression or expression, around ableness. So for example, in Canada, so I often say that I identify as a Black Canadian, but what does that really mean? Because being Black is not a culture on its own, right? Many Black people sort of realize that, for example, Jamaican Canadians don't have a similar culture or upbringing to Nigerian Canadians. But they're both Black, and so we both pass the world we both pass through Canada in the same way. When someone sees us on the street and like crosses the road, or when we are unfairly stopped by a police officer, they're not looking at us and thinking, he looks Haitian, let me stop him. They're thinking, he's Black, right? So that's a pair of identity. It's identity that's given to me by society that I didn't choose, that impacts the way in which I go through Canada, the way in which I see Canada. We have sort of gender impressions. So for example, someone who may identify as male, but they have feminine traits or feminine characteristics. And so people assume that they're gay, for example. And if you're in a society that's very accepting, that might not be that big of a deal. But if you're in a society that's very homophobic, being perceived as gay, whether or not you actually are gay because of certain feminine traits that you may exhibit, that changes the way in which you walk through the world. With trans people, how well they pass can determine their safety. How well they pass as male or female can really determine their safety. How well people can see them and know they're trans or not. When we look at ableness, a lot of, we think about like culture, but we also think about like ability. So for example, the deaf community, you've got your capital D deaf, people who culturally identify as deaf, who, sort of know deaf history and really sort of identify with that deaf culture. And then people who are small d deaf, who are physically deaf, but they don't really feel a belonging to the culture. And so they're deaf because it's their ability or disability or ableness, but they're not deaf culturally. But yet, regardless, society is still going to treat them as a deaf person, regardless of whether they're identifying with that culture or not. And so we've got these two sort of identities that shape the way in which we see the world, that shape the way in which we approach the world, but also the way in which the world approaches us. And when I was putting together this slideshow, this really sort of had me thinking, because every Black person I know, for example, has a distinct memory of when they realized they were Black. Because all of us don't grow up thinking, oh, we're Black. All of us grow up thinking, oh, my parents are Nigerian, my parents are Haitian, my parents are Congolese, this is our food, this is our culture, this is our clothing, this is our language. But very few of us grow up thinking, oh, this is our skin color. And then there's a point where something happens to you as a Black person that doesn't happen to your non-Black friends, where you're like, I'm Black, and that's what that means. And so that kind of sort of shows a really interesting distinction between your internal chosen identity and the pair of identity, the identity that society gives to you. So to reconnect this with the oceans is just to say that the way in which we connect with the oceans, the way in which we connect with nature, the way in which we connect with environmental movements, it's really dependent on not just our internal culture, but also the way in which society perceives us and perceives what we're able to do and what we're allowed to do. And so with that in mind, I wanted to give you guys a couple of questions for you guys to think about and reflect on in your own way. Think about when you first saw the ocean. If you have ever seen an ocean, some of you might be joining us from Saskatchewan and have never left the province. So think about when you first saw the ocean, if you've ever seen an ocean. Think about the ocean story in your family's history. Who crossed the ocean to get here? Did anyone cross an ocean to get here? If you're Indigenous, no one crossed an ocean to get here. Think about the ocean story in your community. So maybe in your family, someone, hopped into a plane and flew over the ocean. But maybe in the larger context of a community, in a Canadian context, a lot of people of the same background as you were refugees who hopped into a boat and had to fight the waves to get here. Think of what the relationship that your parents and your guardians have with the ocean. Do they have one? How does that impact your relationship with the ocean? And, you know, what does the ocean mean to you? And so like, just sort of an example that always comes to mind is, you know, who taught you how to canoe? For many of you, it was probably your parents or a family member. You learned it when you're a kid. You're comfortable in a canoe. But what if you were a first generation Canadian who has, you know, who you're the first in your family to really sort of form a connection with the Canadian oceans, so the Pacific, Arctic, Atlantic, depending where you are. How do you form a bond with the ocean? What would make you feel welcome in blue spaces? Right? Like if there's an activity a lot of people have been doing since childhood and you've never done and you're an adult, are you comfortable learning? Are you comfortable being in that boat and seeing and having other people see you wobble? What would make that place a safe space for you to explore an ocean connection with you? For me personally, the person who taught me how to canoe was actually my PhD supervising professor. So low-key funny. There's actually a funny story behind that, but essentially I was supposed to teach an environmental assessment course at the University of Ottawa. And we had to get to an island and I had to lead the students via canoe to this island. And I was like, I've never been in a canoe before. And my professor's like, fantastic, let me teach you how to canoe so you can ensure that you don't accidentally have these students drown on their way to this island. But you know, it's a fun memory for me, and it gave me a safe space where it was me and my professor alone on the waters. Like, you know, 2 days before the students showed up. My first time in that canoe was not in front of other people, and it created that safe space for me, right? So as I started talking about myself, I'm going to share a little bit about how my identities are tied to the ocean. And these are just a couple of examples, just to kind of, you know, give you guys that frame of mind where you guys can think about how your identities are tied to the ocean. So as a Canadian, I identify, oh, sorry, give me 1 second. Yeah, so as a Canadian, I identify the oceans and the cultural and economic significance to our country, right? We are literally the only country in the world whose unified territory touches 3 oceans. We receive such a large amount of economic benefit from the oceans, whether it's through seafood import and exportation, whether it is through tourism that's based around the oceans. We receive so much benefit from the oceans. And as a Canadian, I have to sort of recognize that. And culturally speaking, we're very tied to the oceans. As a Franco Albertan, I identify the ocean because it is through navigating the waterways in Canada to buy and sell fur that French Canadians were able to reach Alberta and create homes and settlements and create this beautiful culture that I got adopted into. Without being ocean-faring people, there would be no French in Alberta. And so I would not have had that culture to connect to, and I would not be Franco-Albertan today. So I have that link to the oceans as a result of my Franco-Albertan identity. As a Black person in North America, I think about how the slave trade and how many Black people died in the waves, either committing suicide or being tossed overboard by their white captors. And that's a painful story for me to think about, because I think every time I look at the oceans, you know, I feel so many mixed emotions. I feel pride as a Canadian. I feel pride as a Francophone. I feel responsibility as a human being. I feel responsibility as a Canadian and a Francophone. But then I also look at the oceans and think to myself, how many dead Black bodies are at the bottom of this ocean that did not choose to embark on an adventure, but were forced onto a boat to come to North America to be horribly mistreated for generations and have repercussions that affect me today. And so this is also what I mean when I say, you know, look at both your personal family's ocean story. You know, my family just hopped into a plane, crossed the oceans via plane, and your community's ocean story. As a Black person, the ocean has also a significance from my Blackness. And then, you know, as a Black Canadian, I think about how much it meant to me seeing Boucar Diouf, a Black Quebecois man and ocean scientist, rise to fame. Because I'd never really seen Black people in blue spaces. Never, like, I actually want all of you to take a moment and maybe put this in the chat box if anyone comes to mind, but can any of you think of a non-white Canadian marine biologist? That it's someone that comes to mind, someone that's well known, someone that's well respected in their field. because I can't until Boukhar Diop came onto the screen, and he has done phenomenal things. He received a PhD in oceanography at Université du Québec à Rimouski, and he won like the Le Prix du Québec, like the highest award you can get in Quebec. He's very well known, and it was really, really cool seeing someone that looked like me, a francophone, be this man who loves the ocean and is an expert on the ocean. Like that to me was like, whoa, amazing, crazy. And then to be so well loved and accepted by his community, I was like, oh my God, this is so great. So I just think about how much that representation meant to me. And so my ocean story, and I think all of our ocean stories, are continually evolving. You know, every time other Black people continue to experience the oceans, that adds to my story because it adds to my collective experience as a Black person. Every time other Francophones continue experiencing the oceans, that adds to my story because it adds to my story as a Francophone, you know, as an Albertan, as a Canadian. So as things change, whether on a personal level for me, like I have a specific interaction with the ocean, or whether a group that I feel affinity to has an interaction with the ocean, that impacts my ocean story and that impacts my relationship with the ocean, whether affirming it or dissolving it or doing whatever it does to it. But it's my ocean story, and I think all of our ocean stories are continually evolving. And I think it's something that we need to keep awareness with, because in understanding how we are connected to the oceans, we can better understand how other people are not or have a different connection to the oceans. And so we stop thinking about a one size fits all, because we start realizing that what fits us might not necessarily fit someone else. And so we create those spaces where we realize that like there were no spaces before. So with that in mind, that makes a nice transition into what are the barriers to blue spaces? And so I kind of divided this into two sort of major barriers. So the first one is environmental racism. And I think we've all heard the term before, but the term is used in so many different instances that it's hard to sort of like pin down what exactly it means. And I think the meaning is continually evolving. So in the past, environmental racism manifested in terms of histories of slavery, indentured servitude, and white supremacy in immigration, right? We think about sort of like not just Chinese Canadians, but definitely Chinese Canadians, but also, you know, Punjabi Canadians and a whole bunch of different Canadians who showed up in Canada by boat at a time when Canada was only accessible by boat or by ship. And a lot of times they showed up in very uncomfortable ships that they were on for weeks, that, you know, they got scurvy, and it was not pleasant to show up on Canada's shores and for Canada to be like, you're not white, we don't want you, go home. And so the amount of people that died trying to come here or died being sent home, you know, that's environmental racism. We look at sort of land sovereignty of Indigenous people and how that was significantly reduced during a certain period in Canada. And that's environmental racism, because we were taking the best land from the Indigenous people and trying to renegade them to land we did not want or land we did not see as valuable. So reducing their ability to fully access the environment. And then, you know, we look at how sort of Indigenous and non-white workers were often forced to live closer to places that needed remediation. So like abandoned mine sites, for example. And I just wanted to put that in the past. It's also definitely a present day issue. You know, there's many areas in Canada that are considered hazardous. And the people that live closest to those areas tend to be Indigenous reserves, or they tend to be, you know, people of color, mostly Black people. So it sort of, you know, really highlights that. And this past environmental racism has a habit of twisting the histories of the environment in people's collective ancestry that have implications on today's generation. So, you know, if a lot of your ancestors died in the waters as they tried to get to a better life in Canada, only to be rejected by Canada for no other reason than the color of their skin, that twists the way in which your people and your culture approach the ocean. And that impacts you today, because it impacts the way in which you had to find your way to the ocean. it's a lot of unlearning, a lot of relearning. Yeah. And, when we talk about reducing land sovereignty for Indigenous people, we're also talking about the psychosocial impacts of deeming Indigenous ways of life inferior, right? So we're looking at a lot of the things that we see today that were due to a lot of the, climate change, all the different things we see today are due to mistreatment of the land, misunderstanding of what nature means and what the environment gives to us. And so by putting down Indigenous ways of life and Indigenous ways of approaching the environment and Indigenous knowledge, we had to reconstruct already existing knowledge in slower means, so that by the time we realize that something is not a right way to go about that we're not going about things the right way, we're already at the point where we're already harming the environment and harming ourselves as a result of harming the environment. But then also going back to sort of that psychosocial component, if your culture, your land, your religion, your outlook on life is tied to the land and tied to nature, and then you're then restricted in your ability to access nature, and you're then harmed for the land that you have, that twists your ability to connect to that land, and it twists your ability to practice your culture, and that twists your ability to be who you are, which we can see has had many negative impacts in Indigenous communities to this day. In a modern day context, environmental racism also manifests as nature being only for those who have the luxury of time, location, or place to afford it. So, for example, think about, and this is also another thing about like racism when we talk about it being systemic. So, for example, in Vancouver, the municipal bylaw has something along the lines of 30% or up to 40% of Vancouver has to be green. But what that effectively does is it creates Stanley Park. But in the entire neighborhoods in Vancouver, mostly poor neighborhoods that don't have a single tree in them. And then you compare that to sort of Montreal's bylaw, which requires that there be a park or a green space every 2 blocks throughout the entire city, which means that even in poor neighborhoods, they may have a crappy park, but they have a park that has trees or that has some sort of plant every 2 blocks required by municipal law. So what we kind of see in Vancouver and a lot of BC is that Indigenous and immigrant communities are more likely to live further away from the ocean, because the ocean property is, high value, high priced. We allow people to have, private beach areas so that that limits access to the public. And so it adds a level of classism to it, but it's also a level of racism, right? Because to be able to afford some of these properties, you have to have generational wealth, either wealth that your family has been accumulating for generations, or your family was able to afford that land before the price exploded and became what it is today. And given that Canada has a very sort of white supremacist, history, those people tend to be white. And so it's created like a very sort of interesting dynamic where a lot of white, well-off, quote unquote, old stock Canadian families in BC have really great access to the ocean. They have, they get to see it from their houses. They get to access it on a daily basis. Whereas other people either live way too far away to access it. They don't have the time to go to the ocean. They're like, oh, it's a 40-minute commute, not worth it. They don't have the money to be able to access some of the spaces. So it really sort of reduces that access and reduces the ability to interact with the ocean and get those benefits that come from interacting with the ocean, the health benefits, the psychosocial benefits, all of that fun stuff. And so that is a form of environmental racism. This has been talked about a lot, but Indigenous communities still face an increased risk of food security and lack of access to drinking water as a result of environmental racism. And then, something that I think a lot of us have noticed is for some reason, pipelines always seem to go through Indigenous communities, go through Indigenous sacred areas, but rarely through white rural communities. And this, once again, speaks to political power, right? Sometimes a pipeline is proposed that's going through a white rural community. And that community will mobilize, they will get their MPs on board, they will have conversations with the oil and gas company. And what tends to happen is the oil and gas executives, most of whom are white as well, will see these rural people and they'll identify with them. They'll be like, oh, you're like my auntie, you remind me of my cousin, you're like my brother. And so they'll sympathize and they'll make the changes that they need to make, as well as also obviously the political pressure is there as well. Whereas indigenous communities tend not to have that political clout, that ability to sort of get the MP to really make a firm stand against something like this. And then in addition, you know, these executives aren't able to identify on a personal level with all these indigenous communities, right? Because different way of life, different way of seeing the world, different way of sort of approaching a lot of things. And so they're often not even speaking, quote unquote, the same language, which again makes it very easy for them to say, nope, we heard you, didn't make sense, we're still gonna force the pipeline through. And that means that any risks that come with any leaks, any risks that come with any spills, more negatively impact these indigenous communities than anyone else. So sort of really looking at, environmental racism. And then the other thing that I think really limits people's abilities to connect to blue space or presents a barrier is representation in blue spaces. So a lot of the middle class in Canada is people of color, mostly Asian people, but you know it's still growing. There's many Black people who are middle class and whatnot, and so they have the luxury of time. They have the money to go out into blue spaces. But in what we're seeing here is the faces of people who see in the oceans, or scientists, or leisurely. We're not seeing diverse faces, right? We're not seeing, you know, Black people surfing. We're not seeing you know, people of color doing things that, you know, sort of are connected to the culture in relationship with the ocean. And so it tends to make people think something along the lines of, oh, that's not my thing. Oh, that's not for me. You know, someone's like, oh, we could go to the beach. You know, for example, a lot of times when we look at people at the beach, a lot of them are tanning, which is cool. But like Black people don't like going tanning as an example. And so if all we can think about when we go to the beach is, oh, you go to the beach to tan, then you're like, it's not my thing. So you assume that the beach or the oceans, once again, are not for you. When there's other things you could do that are more in line with who you are and your identity, but you just aren't aware that those things exist because you haven't seen that representation. You know, the faces of people we see in the oceans in a leisure sense, you know, in terms of science, once again, sort of going back to that whole, you know, how many marine biologists do you know, how many oceanographers do you know that are Canadian that are not white? You know, it's the oceans have effectively become a field where we mostly see white people sort of succeeding and being listed as experts and whatnot. And that lack of representation means that, like, you know, little kids of color aren't like, oh, I want to be an ocean scientist. That's not one of their dreams. But you see a lot of that representation in like sports, for example, because sports was one of the ways in which people of color were recognized for their talents. Or you see that in the army, for example, right? Because the army was one of the ways people of color were able to gain acceptance in society. And so then you see a lot of people having sort of making career plans where it's like, oh, I'm going to go into the army. Oh, I want to become a basketballer. Oh, I want to become XYZ, because they've seen someone who looks like them fully succeed in that field. And so they know it's possible. Then we also chat about sort of the lifestyles we promote. And so once again, when we think about like the oceans in BC, I think it's different for everyone, but I think a lot of us think about like snorkeling and like relaxing on a yacht and like surfing. And it's like, if you don't identify with like surf culture, then it's like, it's not for me. If you don't have like the money for a yacht, or even if you have the money for a yacht, but you see it's a waste of time, you're like, it's not for me. And so, you know, seeing the lifestyles that we promote in relation to the ocean also impact the people who we're going to see enjoying the ocean, because people replicate what they think they enjoy. And so if you're not seeing a lifestyle that corresponds with you, your first thought is not to go and find your own way of doing it. Your thought is, that's not for me, I'm gonna look somewhere else. And then lastly is the concept of invisible welcome signs. So invisible welcome signs are, I think the best way to explain an invisible welcome sign is to use a clothing brand. So let's say you are on a clothing website, you're shopping for something, you're looking for a sweater, and all the models are skinny and female. Even though the sweater might be unisex, as a boy, you might be like, oh, I guess it's not for boys, because all you're seeing are female models wearing the sweater. As someone who might be plus size, you might assume that, oh, I guess this like style doesn't work with my body, because all you're seeing are the skinny models, even if the sweater might go up to size XXL. And so the same thing goes for ethnicity as well. If I'm going through a website and I don't see some of the styles on like Black bodies, I'm like, I guess the colors maybe are not made for my skin tone. Or if you're a Francophone and you go to a website and it's a Canadian company, but it's only available in English, you're like, I guess this isn't really for me. And so when we think about the ocean, we think about the invisible welcome signs. You know, our signs bilingual, so inviting Francophones and Francophone tourists to the province. Are the clothing that you wear for surfing, for example, are those marketed to all body types, or only they marketed to like certain body types? Like, what are we doing that is not necessarily telling people we don't want you, but people feel like we don't want them because they're not seeing something that would let them know that they are welcome, right? So invisible welcome signs. And so with all of that, I think it's now a good moment for me to sort of describe intersectionality. So I feel like many of you have heard intersectionality before. If you're on social media, that word has made the rounds. Intersectionality is the intersectional oppression that arises out of a combination of various oppressions, which together produce something unique and distinct from any one form of discrimination standing alone. So intersectionality effectively recognizes that if you are a queer Black woman, you face a unique type of discrimination that a queer woman wouldn't face, that a Black woman wouldn't face, and that a woman wouldn't face. But as a queer Black woman, those have created the confluence to certain experiences that are unique to you. And so what intersectionality does is it takes into account the historical, social, and political context of this identity, right? Because discrimination is really based around sort of history, politics, political power. And so it recognizes all of that. Then it recognizes the unique experience of the individual. So it recognizes that this may only happen to you, because this is something that I think a lot of us struggle with. You know, sometimes we meet someone who, for example, if I meet an Anglophone Black queer man, and he tells me about a certain discrimination that he went through, I might be like, really? You went through that? I've been in that area. I've never once had, gone through that. And it's like, yes, we're both Black, but we have different experiences because of the other aspects of our identity that have fused together, right? So I think a good example for this is actually like meeting Black Anglophones in Quebec. So Black Anglophones in Quebec are way more likely to be picked up by police and taken to prison for whatever reason. And so it's really interesting because it's like the police will stop you for being Black, but if you're a Black Francophone, they'll stop you maybe unfairly for being Black and then leave you to go on your way. But if you're a Black Anglophone, they're like, oh, let's go to the station and chat more. And so it means that like a lot of Black Francophones don't really understand what Black Anglophones go through, even though we're both Black, for example. And so that's once again talking about intersectionality. And so in recognizing intersectional identities, it allows a particular experience of discrimination based on the confluence of grounds involved to be acknowledged and remedied. And I think that's the key point, and remedied, right? So we recognize someone by saying, I hear you and I believe you. And then we look for solutions to make sure that they feel welcome in that space. And so I ask, as we think about blue spaces and we think about, raising ocean awareness and having events that promote ocean literacy and having events that promote ocean health, we think about intersectionality and what we can do to make sure that everyone feels welcome in these spaces. So with that in mind, what are some interesting ways to integrate your identity into how you connect to the ocean? I wanted to pick some examples from BC so that those of you who are from BC can kind of identify these, and those of you who are not from BC can I guess, learn a little bit, because BC is a very interesting province. So on a mainstream level, on the BC tourism page, they state very clearly over 25,000 kilometers of Pacific coastline, and a rich ecosystem of fish and plant life are a source of sustenance and spirit for British Columbia. So they're calling the ocean a source of spirit for British Columbia, an aspect of British Columbian identity. The Pacific Ocean is the key component of what it means to be a British Columbian. Like, British Columbia could not just randomly be moved inland and you would have the exact same culture evolve. It is because of the ocean that British Columbia is what it is. And so I think that's really, really sort of interesting. And then in taking that a little bit further, we look at some numbers. So seafood brought in 1.29 billion Canadian dollars to BC. This is, this is net money. This is after money has gone to private companies. This is after money has gone to the federal government. $1.29 billion to the British Columbian economy just from seafood. And that's not the only way you make money off the ocean, right? There's tourism, there's a whole bunch of other things. And seafood alone employs almost 5,000 people. So economically, the ocean is essential for BC. BC has the most biologically diverse cold water marine environment on the planet. That's amazing. And, we can definitely in part thank, the First Nations peoples who have been guardians and stewards of the land for as long as they have, because that's been a key component of their culture, is taking care of that, right? It has produced economic independence for many nations and towns. You've got many fishermen villages, nations, towns who very heavily rely on the sea for their food security, but then also for their income. So it's produced that ability for the town to continue existing, right? It takes away that boom-bust cycle that we see in Alberta, that we see in Saskatchewan, that we see in Ontario, where it's like, oh, we've discovered something, this beautiful town emerges, that culture is created, and then that all goes away, and people are like, either I die here and starve, or I relocate and restart my life. And what the ocean has done is allowed BC to have these small towns stay viable. And then you've got a culture that's very highly dependent on the ocean, right? So, many studies have demonstrated, and you see this in BC, that tight-knit communities are formed from communities that live close to oceans. And that's, as a result of like how large the ocean is. It creates stronger social bonds because it allows people to realize how small they are. And so it reinforces social bonds for people to sort of collectively come together. And it also creates a greater sense of environmental stewardship, right? BC is sort of known as, BC and Quebec are like known as like the environmentally conscious provinces, right? These are the provinces that vote green and vote for environmental policies, right? So that's a little bit about like the mainstream BC, which once again, fascinating. But then like, let's look at like cultures in the province. So the Haida, for example, are one of the most well-known First Nations in the country. And their relationship to the ocean is incredibly strong. So for those of you who don't know, the Haida inhabit Haida Gwaii, which are a series of islands just south of Alaska. And their relationship with the ocean is, in their description, timeless and has roots in an era before time even began. So their origin story is based around the idea of human beings coming from the ocean. And so they often say, we came from the ocean, and to the ocean we will return one day. And so they see themselves very much as ocean people, even if they live on land. And I thought this quote by Gujo, who's an Haida artist, was really, really great, which states, "Look past the written word and you'll find yourself in a world whose fate is intimately tied to the ocean people, the sky people, and the forest people, with human beings being the ocean people." So you've got that very sort of intimate relationship with the ocean that's highly dependent on culture, on identity, on outlook in life. And so what it's done is it's created this very interesting sort of reciprocal relationship between the Haida and the oceans, where they benefit from the oceans in terms of food security, in terms of financial independence, in terms of identity. But then at the same time, since the ocean is so important to them as as a family member, it creates a lot of psychological distress when they see ocean pollution wash up on the shores. Even if they're still drinking clean water, it's like an ancestor has been harmed, like a member of your family has been harmed. Um, and that's very, very powerful. So it's something I think we all need to sort of keep in mind, is that when we harm the oceans, when we toss something out, we're not just, hoping that the waves take it away and nothing bad happens, but we're also like psychologically impacting people whose entire identity is based around the ocean. The Franco-Colombian. So les Franco-Colombian, these are Francophone people from British Columbia. British Columbia has a beautiful Francophone community, mostly based in sort of Vancouver and Victoria. And this is the official flag. And so the Franco-Colombian flag was created in 1981 and includes, the symbols of BC, includes the fleur de lis, which is a symbol of the Francophone world. And then they have these blue lines related to the sea and sort of coming from the sea to the mountains. And so they sort of highlight that the sea, the ocean effectively, is an inherent aspect to Francophone identity in the West, because the Francophone culture in BC comes from those fur traders who crossed the province all the way from Quebec, crossed the entire country via boat, via canoe, hitting up the oceans to get all the way to BC and set themselves up. And so, it's just an inherent part of who they are. It's integrated into the flag and it's integrated into the identity. As a side note, you also see the ocean obviously on the BC flag itself as well. Then, we think about like the gay community. So this is a really lovely quote from Hannah Williams. The sea and queerness have always been intertwined. The waves were a liminal space, not bound to the rules of societies on land. It's a place away from the eyes of family and friends, where desires can be explored away from the categorization and labels of conservative heteronormative society. And so effectively, when we look at the seas and queerness, there were a lot of gay pirates, like a lot of pirates were gay. And the reason for this was because while there was a lot of homophobia on land and many laws enacted to ensure that homosexuality was not quote unquote practiced and homosexuals were like, really sort of kicked out of society, the sea did not have those laws. And so there's many instances of pirates practicing what they call mateship, which is almost like a marriage ceremony, but between two people of the same gender. And they would mate for life. They also had provisions for bisexuals, and they had provisions for lesbians. And so the ocean allowed queer people to be queer at a time when queerness was very much not accepted in Canada and in BC. And so it holds a very sort of it's a very important aspect of queer history, because it allowed for queerness to exist at a time when queerness was truly the worst thing you could be. And then, there we go, sorry. We have the Chinese British Columbians. And so, yeah, it wasn't easy for early Chinese Canadians to come to Canada. They faced a voyage of over 10,000 kilometers across the Pacific Ocean on ships that provided little to no comfort. They were horribly mistreated when they arrived. The ocean story there is not great. But what we see in the present, for example, is the Canadian International Dragon Boat Festival, which takes place every June on the waters and shoresides of Falls Creek in Vancouver. And it is North America's largest and most competitive dragon boat festival, with over 200 crews competing from around the world. And it's run by the Canadian International Dragon Boat Festival Society, commonly called Dragon Boat BC. And what this is a gift to all of Canada. Look at a new way of connecting the ocean that's inherently cultural. Dragon boats. Canada is one of the best countries in the world in dragon boat racing. And this thanks to Chinese British Columbians who brought the practice to Canada and taught it to the rest of us, and allowed the rest of us to enjoy it, and allowed the rest of us to see that this is a different, interesting, fascinating way to connect to the oceans. Fun fact, before I ever stepped in a canoe, I have been dragon boat racing before. Like, that is crazy. Like, I've connected to the ocean via dragon boats before I've connected via canoe in Canada as a Canadian. And that's thanks to the Chinese British Columbians who brought this practice with them. And connected with these new oceans in their own unique way and pass it down to all of us. So with all of that being said, finally on topic, why should the Next Little Mermaid be Black? So I broke it down into 3 reasons. The first reason is familiarity. Little Mermaid is the only Disney princess movie that focuses on the oceans. It's a classic movie that almost everyone has grown up with. In Canada, outside Canada, Disney's done a really great job in marketing, honestly. And whether you're white or non-white, you have grown up most likely with The Little Mermaid in some way, shape, or form. Like, you've probably heard about the movie, even if you've never watched it. And this movie has inspired many generations of marine biologists, oceanographers, and children who just wanted to be mermaids, right? This is a movie where you watch it as a child and you become obsessed with mermaids. And you start Googling mermaids, you start Googling fish, you start learning about the oceans, and then that can lead to a career. And so it's a powerful movie, and it's powerful because of that sense of nostalgia that we all have as a result of this movie, and the way it sort of is in our childhoods and in our collective conscious. I can make references to Little Mermaid, and I think most people would understand me. Number 2, representation matters. So by having a Black Little Mermaid, Black kids can freely imagine themselves not only as fantastical mermaids in a world, but they can also see themselves in a world where they are part of serving our oceans. With a Black Little Mermaid, a whole new generation of Black marine biologists could come to be. And I think that is really powerful, that ability to see yourself as this. I mean, there are many, many times, I've heard many stories from many Black girls actually who, for Halloween wanted to dress up as a Little Mermaid, and their friends or even their teachers would tell them, oh no, that's not really for you. How would your hair work? Like, how would this work? Like, you don't have that, right? Black hair is different. So in having a Black Little Mermaid, it says, no, you also can be this fantastical mermaid creature, and you also can be a part of our oceans. And it sort of allows for that unlearning of our collective ocean history of slavery, and a relearning to love the ocean as an environmental entity, as an ecosystem, as a world unto its own. It's a way of seeing Black people in the ocean without seeing Black people dead in the ocean. And that leads me to the third point. The world needs more Black scientists. Frankly, the world needs more scientists in general, but the world needs more Black scientists. The world needs more Black little kids who want to become scientists. And a film about a Black Little Mermaid has a potential to be a cultural inflection point towards a more inclusive ocean conservation. And, sort of going back to the representation point, but also this point as well, it stops people from being surprised, right? When you're the first in something, you have a lot of people who are either naysayers or they're surprised, and it can be discouraging. And so not only does the Black Little Mermaid allow Black people to see themselves in ocean spaces, but it allows non-Black people also to see Black people in ocean spaces and not be as surprised when they see a Black marine biologist, not be as surprised when they see a Black person being like, yeah, I used to dress up as a mermaid all the time. Not being as surprised when they see a Black person being like, I want to be an oceanographer. And so it sort of really allows for that. It puts in everyone's mind that Black people are ocean people. I saw this really powerful poem that I wanted to share. And it's by Jasmine Mans, and it says, when they tell the Black girl she can't play mermaid, ask them what their people know about holding their breath underwater. I think that speaks volumes. So we're coming to the end of the presentation, and I just wanted to leave you guys with some takeaways. What can you do to be more inclusive in your ocean work, in your ocean advocacy, in your love of the oceans? How can you spread that in a way that gets more people on board? And how can you spread it in a way that gets the full diversity of Canada on board? So my first point is know your ocean history. And what I mean when I say this is, in understanding your history of the ocean, you know who has had negative experiences in blue spaces and how these experiences were shaped. And those complicated links can help you think outside the box in ways of restructuring those ocean connections. Understand the different identities via the ocean in different ways. know who your message is for. And so in acknowledging the limits of your message, by understanding who you have created it for, and in doing so, who you have excluded. If your message is for everyone, then you've most likely failed at it landing with marginalized communities, right? Normally, like when a message is for everyone, it's for the mainstream, which means anyone who's marginalized is probably not going to identify with that message. And so in knowing who your message is for, in acknowledging the limits of your message, you know who you're missing. And so you can craft new messages for the people that you know you're missing with your original message. So that's not to say don't make your message for people that are like you, but then also in knowing that you can make your message for people who aren't like you, right? Diversify planning. I think this is a basic one, but it sort of needs to be re-emphasized. Ensure that when you plan an event for the oceans, that the table is diverse, because even through one's lived experiences, one can identify knockdown barriers that you never even thought about. I think a good example of this is H&M. I think a lot of you remember that scandal H&M had where they put one of their Black kid models in like a shirt that said monkey. And it was like super scandalous because monkey has been a term that has been used to degrade Black people across the world, in Africa and in North America, since colonization. And so it's a term that a lot of Black people are very sensitive about. But obviously H&M didn't mean any offense. Like we know H&M didn't mean any offense. But the entire board who approved this was white people in Sweden. And so in not having that diversity, there was no one to say, ooh, this doesn't work for XYZ reason. There was no one to call them out on that. And so they ended up being called out by their global audience because the second they decided to, branch out outside of Sweden, they needed to have that diversity. So, when you have different voices involved from the beginning, you're less likely to make faux pas that come from ignorance because you're able to benefit from other people's lived experiences as well. Be open to feedback. This is the only way to know that you're growing. I know feedback is tough to swallow sometimes. I myself struggle with feedback. And if you are one of those people who does struggle in getting feedback, when you receive feedback, there's no obligation to respond immediately. Sit with it. Take time. Look for if that feedback has validity. If it's not valid, if you're absolutely sure it's not valid, fair enough. But if it's valid in any way, take what's valid. Leave out the rest, right? A lot of times when people are called out or called in or whatever the English term is now, the person who's doing the calling out might be frustrated. They might be tired of having those calls. They might not call it in a gentle way. They might not call it in a way that takes into consideration your feelings. That doesn't mean you should discard what they said. Sit with it. Take a moment, step away, be like, oh, that frustrated me. Why is she calling me out that way? That's unfair. I've done so much XYZ. Step away, be frustrated, don't respond. Then come back later, look at it with fresh eyes and be like, okay, as much as I don't like the tone in which they address me, they have a point and I can improve in this way, right? And lastly, create community. You don't have to do everything on your own. And in creating partnerships, having conversations, bringing other organizations on board, talking to local students and getting youth involved, talking to immigration centers and getting new Canadians involved, talking to La Fédération des Francophones de Colombie-Britannique to get Francophones involved, leaning on community and allowing community to grow. What you're doing is you're using blue spaces, you're using the ocean to create community. And that is powerful because that reshapes people's ocean story. And that reshapes the way in which people connect to the ocean. And you're not just reshaping individuals, but then you're reshaping collectivities, right? If one Black person is very vocal about what a great ocean experience they had, it collectively impacts other Black people to be like, oh, I have never thought of doing that. I could connect to the ocean that way too. If one, Asian person feels very welcome in rental spaces, that collectively impacts the community. It's one of those things that, yeah, use blue spaces to create community. You don't have to do everything on your own. You don't have to be overwhelmed and be like, we're a small team of 3 people. We're a family run this. We can't do all of that. No, you can't, but you're not alone. You're not alone in this country. You're not alone in your efforts. You're not alone in trying to save the oceans. There's so many other people you can lean on, so many other people you can bring in and create community. And so with that, I know I went a little bit over time, so I don't know if we have time for questions or not. Kirsten, hit me up. Let me know what's up.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Chuck. That was amazing and such a wide range of topics that we covered in the last hour and 10 minutes. I don't think we have time for questions because we are running a little bit over, but I can forward them to you and then make sure that the people who ask questions, we can email them out when we send out the recording, the answers to the questions.
Perfect. We will do that then. Here is my social media. Here's Future Ancestors' social media. Feel free to follow us, tweet at us, let us know what you thought of this talk. Always love hearing from people. And I guess since we're finishing it off, I wanted to share one last quote with all of you as you go out into your rest of the day, into the rest of your week, into the rest of your bio blitz, into your ocean collecting. This is by Ai Yazawa, a young Japanese person. And she said, "I was happy anywhere I could see the ocean." I think this is a good way to end. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for coming. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I wish that we could see an applause and hear applause from everyone who's in here, because I'm sure there would be. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. We did have one question in the chat that I can answer, and we will be sending out a recording of this and all of the BioBlitz recordings next week after the BioBlitz is over. So, and we also, just a reminder, we still have 3 more speakers coming up over the course of the next week. So tomorrow we're going to be learning about birds with Birds Canada. Thursday is exploring the intertidal zone, and that's with Sequaria Ocean Education, and they have touch tanks, so they'll be able to like get up close and personal with the animals. And then on Friday, we're gonna get wild about whales and learn about marine mammals with the BC Cetacean Sighting Network. So I hope to see everyone at those talks as well, and definitely make sure to keep recording things in the BioBlitz. I'm really excited to see the number keep going up over the course of the week, and I'll see everyone at the next webinar tomorrow. Thank you.